London 1892, the season every debutante dreamed of, and one girl feared most. Boom. The sound was not of thunder but of a door thrown open so violently its hinges screamed, and with it the first shards of Lady Arya Pembroke's dignity seemed to splinter across the chapel floor. The hush that followed was immediate, a silence sharpened by 100 curious breaths held in anticipation of spectacle. Arya stood at the threshold of St. Bartholomew's Chapel, veiled and trembling, her gloved hands clutching the bouquet that now felt unbearably heavy. Moments earlier she had imagined walking forward as a bride, now she sensed she approached something far crueler. The guests, draped in jewel-colored silks and stiff brocades, shifted like restless tides. Their whispers fluttered through the incense-thick air. They spoke her name in tones of pity and relish, wondering aloud if the rumors were true, if the Pembroke girl had indeed been abandoned before she'd even reached the altar. Arya kept her gaze low, for to meet their eyes was to court the final blow to her composure. She felt society's judgment pressing against her spine, urging her to falter. Her father, Viscount Pembroke, waited midway down the aisle, paler than she had ever seen him. His usually composed expression strained under humiliation. He held a small folded note, its edges crushed where his fist had tightened. When Arya reached him, he offered his arm, but the gesture felt more like an apology than an invitation. She took it quietly, sensing the tremor he tried to suppress. "The groom is not coming," he whispered, voice rasped raw. "He left London at dawn." The words struck with quiet brutality. Arya did not gasp or cry. Instead, she felt something inside her retreat, fold inward, shielding itself from the cold bite of truth. She let her breath out slowly, steadying her trembling fingers around the crushed bouquet. The petals brushed her palm like a farewell. "Why?" she asked, though she already feared the answer. "He has run off with Lady Marrow's heiress," he murmured. "And he left this." He passed her the note. Arya did not read it, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood that whatever apology lay within would not soften the wound. She closed her hand around it, feeling its weight far more than that of the flowers she held. A murmur rose among the guests as realization spread that the ceremony was collapsing. Some looked away out of decorum, others leaned forward, eager for spectacle. The rector stood uncertainly at the altar. Arya imagined her humiliation echoing through London by nightfall, carried by voices that delighted in scandal. Her father guided her to a side alcove, away from the hungry stares. In its dim shadow she lifted her veil. Her eyes shimmered but did not spill tears. The Viscount placed a trembling hand upon her shoulder. "I am ruined," he whispered. "But worse, my dearest, you." "Do not finish," Arya said softly. "I know." Reputation in their world was a fragile mask. Once cracked, it could never be restored. A bride abandoned at the altar would be a subject of mockery, pinned to drawing-room conversations for months. Arya's future, already precarious due to her family's modest finances, seemed to dissolve like ink in water. A rustle of boots drew their attention. A man in the king's colors approached, his expression solemn. He bowed respectfully. "Viscount Pembroke, His Majesty's Council extends a proposal that may preserve your daughter's honor." Arya stiffened. Nothing good began with the promise of preservation. "The Duke of Hawthorne seeks a bride," the messenger said. "He is willing to marry at once, with discretion. His estate is prepared for immediate ceremony." Her father inhaled sharply, both hope and dread flickering across his features. Edmund Hawthorne was a name spoken cautiously. Reclusive. Rumored blind. Rumored cold. A noble whose misfortune had become twisted into legend. Arya felt a slow chill settle in her chest. "Marry him?" she asked quietly. "Tonight." The messenger nodded. "The alternative, my lady, is that London will feast upon your tragedy before dusk. His Grace offers protection. A new beginning. Protection." The word carried promise and threat in equal measure. Her father turned to her with desperate eyes. "Arya, we have little choice." But Arya tasted the painful truth beneath his words. "You will be devoured if you remain." She looked toward the chapel doors. Behind them lay the whispers, the judgment, the laughter disguised as sympathy. A world ready to crush her dignity beneath polished boots. She lifted her chin. "I will go," she said quietly. "If this marriage will spare us the worst of their cruelty, then I will go." Her father exhaled shakily. The messenger bowed once more, then motioned for Arya to follow. As she stepped from the alcove, her fingers brushed the unopened note. For the first time she felt anger kindle beneath her ribs, not a violent flame but a quiet ember. She crossed the threshold of the chapel again, no longer a bride but something else, someone reshaped by disgrace and held together by fragile resolve. The guests watched her departure in a hush. Their silence followed her into the street like a final benediction. The carriage door closed behind her with a heavy thud. As the horses jolted forward, Arya glanced back once. The chapel receded, its spire piercing the gray sky. The carriage's interior smelled faintly of cedar and old leather, a scent that wrapped around her like a reminder of how swiftly life could change. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass and watched the city blur past, its cobblestones slick with the memory of rain. Every turn of the wheels seemed to beat out a question she could not yet answer. What awaited her now? She felt the weight of destiny gathering like stormlight along the horizon now. Only then did she finally open the abandoned groom's note. Its single sentence struck harder than any whisper ever could. And as her breath caught, she realized the cruelty of her ruined wedding day was merely the beginning. Arya had always believed that humiliation had a sound, sharp, ringing, irreversible, but she had not known it could echo long after the church bells stopped and the whispers faded. By the time she arrived at Blackthorn Hall the following afternoon, that echo had settled inside her ribs like a second heartbeat, pulsing with every carriage jolt. Her father sat rigid beside her, face carved in stone, not from concern but from fury that dared not speak its name. He had lost a political alliance. She had lost the illusion that her life belonged to her. The horses slowed as the estate loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the pale sky, ancient and proud enough to judge anyone who approached with trembling hands. Arya straightened her spine, pretending composure she did not feel, though the memory of yesterday's public rejection clung to her like invisible thorns. The Duke of Hawthorne, her new husband by abrupt decree, was said to be blind, reclusive, and sharp-tongued, yet far too wealthy and powerful for her father to refuse. She tried not to imagine what kind of man awaited her behind those high doors, nor what expression he would wear when told he was to marry a discarded bride. The doors opened before she could gather her breath, and Lord Whitford, her father's political ally and the king's envoy, stepped forward, greeting them with the stiff courtesy of a man enacting an unpleasant duty. He explained the arrangements briskly, barely pausing to ensure she followed. The Duke had agreed to wed her within the week, quiet and without ceremony, to prevent scandal from spreading through the aristocracy any further. The king himself had blessed the union, largely to protect the throne from messy rumors involving her former groom's debts and her father's hastily concealed dealings. Arya listened in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, because any protest would surrender the last scrap of dignity she still possessed. The corridors they walked through were lined with portraits of previous dukes, each bearing a stern expression and a sword, recalling eras marked by war and loyalty. Arya felt their gazes follow her, as if weighing whether she was worthy of stepping into this lineage. When she finally reached the room prepared for her, the maid assigned to her bowed gently and offered warm tea, honeyed and floral. But Arya barely tasted it. Instead, she paced the chambers, every detail reminding her she was a guest, not a wife, yet. She imagined the Duke somewhere within these walls, perhaps navigating by touch, perhaps sitting in brooding silence, perhaps already resentful at the burden she represented. Her mind spun with possibilities until she caught her reflection in the mirror, pale but defiant. She needed to be stronger than she had been at the altar yesterday. She needed to believe this marriage would not be another stage upon which she would be humiliated. Evening approached when she heard the soft knock at her door. Lord Whitford entered again, informing her the Duke wished to speak with her privately before dinner. At those words her breath snagged. She had expected to meet him at some point but not so soon, not when her nerves still felt like exposed wires. Nonetheless, she nodded, smoothing her gown with trembling fingers before following him down a shorter corridor lit by warm sconces. The air grew cooler as they progressed, as though the castle itself held its breath. At a tall door of polished oak, Lord Whitford paused, offering a gentle reassurance that the Duke was a fair man, though misunderstood. The envoy's voice softened, hinting at something unsaid, but before Arya could inquire, he opened the door. The study was quiet, the fire burning low. Arya stepped inside hesitantly, searching the dim space for the silent figure she sensed rather than saw. Then she noticed him, Julian, Duke of Hawthorne, standing near the window, his posture immaculate, his head slightly bowed as though contemplating the garden beyond. She expected him to turn his face blindly toward her, unfocused, but instead he moved with a precision that startled her, lifting his gaze in direct acknowledgement of her presence. For an instant she froze. His eyes were clear, steady, far too aware. The rumors had been wrong or perhaps crafted deliberately. Confusion flickered across her features and she feared he noticed. Yet he made no move to explain himself. "Lady Arya," he said, his voice smooth but carrying a quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I am sorry that your introduction to marriage has been marked by such cruelty." His words pierced through the fog of her expectations, reaching the tender bruised place inside her chest. She had braced herself for coldness or indifference, but instead she found sincerity. Julian studied her with a subtle furrow of concern, as though reading every emotion she tried to conceal. She replied carefully, thanking him for receiving her and admitting she did not wish to be a burden to his household. At that, a faint shadow crossed his expression and he stepped closer, not too close, but enough to make it clear he wished to speak without the barrier of distance. "You are not a burden," he said softly. "If anything, you have been wronged far more than anyone around you seems willing to admit." Arya blinked, startled by the unexpected gentleness in his tone. She had not realized how desperately she needed someone to acknowledge the cruelty she'd endured until the moment he offered that simple truth. Something fragile inside her trembled. Julian motioned toward the seats near the fireplace, and they sat opposite each other, the warmth drawing them into a tentative cocoon of safety. Their conversation unfolded slowly, revealing glimpses of shared values and unspoken wounds. He asked about her interests, her childhood, her ambitions, questions no man had cared to ask her before. She found herself speaking more freely than she intended, as though the quiet of the room urged honesty. Yet one question lingered at the back of her mind, pulsing with growing boldness. Why had everyone said he was blind when his gaze held hers with absolute clarity? She remained silent, unsure whether she had the right to pry. But Julian seemed to sense the weight of her curiosity, for his expression shifted, the firelight catching the hint of a secret beneath it. He drew a slow breath as though preparing to unveil something heavy, something that might alter the path her life was taking. Arya's heart thudded. And somewhere inside that silence, Arya felt a fragile thread tightening. A warning, a promise, or perhaps the beginning of a truth she had never dared to imagine before fate finally turned. Boom. The storm began not in the sky but in Arya's chest, a sudden thundering that stole her breath the moment Julian closed the study door behind them. The sound echoed in the room's stillness, an unspoken warning that the fragile calm between them was about to fracture. Rain pressed against the windows like restless fingers, and the evening light faded until the room felt suspended between confession and consequence. Julian stood by the hearth, his profile half-lit, as though he were composed of secrets that dared not fully meet the glow. Arya felt the weight of her earlier suspicion gather like smoke. He saw her. He truly saw her, and yet the world insisted he could not see it all. She had spent the night tossing between disbelief and the faint, foolish hope that his clarity meant something more than deception. Now, faced with him again, she was not sure whether she wished to hear the truth or to remain in the safety of not knowing. Julian broke the silence first, his tone gentle but edged with something shadowed. "You deserve honesty," he said as though the word itself tasted unfamiliar. "Especially when your life has been altered without your consent." Arya folded her hands tightly, steadying the pulse that threatened to leap from her throat. She nodded, encouraging him to continue, though she feared the shape his confession might take. He drew closer, taking a seat opposite her, and for a brief moment neither spoke. The rain softened as if the world itself leaned in to listen. "At court," he began slowly, "truth is a weapon. Sometimes the only way to survive is to pretend the blade is dull." Arya frowned, not understanding. Julian met her gaze with startling directness. "They believe I am blind," he said. "Because I allowed them to." Her breath hitched, though part of her had known. Part of her had seen it in the certainty of his movements, the way he looked at her with more awareness than any sightless man could. Still, hearing it aloud sent a flutter of shock through her chest. She parted her lips to speak, but Julian lifted a hand, not to silence her, but to ask gently for a moment more. "My late wife's family sought to use me for favor," he continued. "The King's Council sought to use me for influence. Every eye in London was fixed upon me, waiting to shape my future to their will. When the accident occurred, when they believed I had lost my sight, I realized the only freedom left to me was the falsehood they so readily accepted." Arya felt sorrow stir within her, not for his deception, but for the burden behind it. The loneliness in his voice was unmistakable. She had spent years being overlooked, he had spent years being scrutinized. Their cages were different, yet painfully mirrored. "And now," Julian said, exhaling softly, "that falsehood has been thrust upon you as well. I did not intend for you to become part of it." His voice lowered. I would not have chosen deception as the foundation of our union. Arya leaned forward slightly, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. Why tell me now? Julian hesitated, eyes flickering with vulnerability so unguarded it startled her. Because, he said quietly, you looked at me with trust. I have not earned that, but I refuse to let it be built upon a lie. The confession settled between them, heavy yet strangely liberating. Arya felt something within her soften, not forgiveness, not entirely, but the beginning of understanding. She rose slowly, walking to the window where rain slid like silver threads down the glass. My first marriage ended in humiliation, she said softly. And the second began in secrecy. Her reflection wavered against the dark pain. What am I to make of it? Julian joined her, keeping a respectful distance. Make of it what you need to, he replied. If you wish for separation after the scandal fades, I will grant it without hesitation. If you wish for civility only, you shall have it. But if you find it within yourself to build something new, something honest, then I will match that honesty with every truth I possess. Arya turned toward him, startled by the unguarded sincerity in his voice. This was not a man clawing for control or image. This was a man exhausted by shadows, offering her the first earnest piece of himself. The room felt warmer now, as though his honesty had stirred the air. And what truth is it, she whispered, that you fear most to speak? Julian's gaze dropped briefly to the floor before rising again, steady but trembling at the edges. That when I first saw you in my study I felt something shift in me, he admitted. Not pity nor obligation, but a desire to protect what little light you still carried after such cruelty. And that desire frightened me more than any lie I ever told. Arya felt her breath falter. She had expected strategy, sympathy, perhaps even regret, but not tenderness. Not this startling, fragile confession that left her heart unmoored. She stepped closer without realizing it, drawn by a force she could neither name nor resist. I do not know what to say, she murmured. You need not say anything, he replied. Just let truth exist between us, even if only in this moment. His hand remained at his side, yet Arya sensed the restraint in him, the deliberate choice not to reach for her, though his every word suggested he wished to. That restraint touched her more deeply than any bold gesture could. It spoke of respect, of patience, of a man unwilling to claim what she was not yet ready to give. A distant peal of thunder rolled across the sky, drawing their attention to the dimming horizon. The rain had slowed, tapping softly against the window in a rhythm that seemed to echo the unspoken tension between them. Arya inhaled, steadying herself. If you could see me so clearly, she said quietly, why allow the world to believe otherwise? Julian's expression shifted, something between resolve and sorrow. Because sight, he answered, is not nearly as dangerous as being seen. And there are those at court who would use my perception against me. But you, his voice softened into something almost reverent. You are the one person I dare to let see me as I am. The words settled in her like a warm ache. She did not know yet whether to trust the feeling they ignited, but she could not deny its pull. And as she studied the man who had lived in darkness by choice, she realized she now stood on the precipice of a truth larger than either of them. For the first time since her ruined wedding, Arya felt the faintest tremor of possibility, dangerous, delicate, and impossibly new. Then Julian, with a breath that trembled, said the words that would change everything. There is one truth I have not yet spoken, one that threatens far more than my reputation, and it concerns your former betrothed. A crack of thunder split the distant sky, though no storm had been forecast, and Arya felt the sound tear through the fragile peace she had begun to build within Hawthorne Hall. The previous night's confession, Edmund's truth, his vulnerability, his unwoven walls, still warmed her, yet the unexpected roar carried an omen-like weight that made her pulse tremble. She stood beside the tall window, fingertips grazing the cold glass, as if steadying herself against a world eager to test the quiet bloom growing between them. Edmund entered with a steadiness she no longer mistook for aloofness. His voice fell gently behind her, asking whether she wished to ride out the strange weather with him to the old chapel on the western hill, a place he seldom visited. She turned, surprised by the invitation, sensing there was more behind it than a ride. The tension in his posture, the slight tightness around his eyes, spoke of something unspoken. They set out together, the path leading them through wild heather and the soft rise of Northumberland fields. Arya felt an unfamiliar steadiness in Edmund's presence, a quiet certainty that soothed her fears even as the sky darkened. He spoke little, but every silence between them held warmth rather than distance. She sensed he was gathering courage for a confession he had not yet named. When they reached the small stone chapel, its doorway overgrown with ivy and its roof surrendered to storms, Edmund drew his horse beside hers and dismounted. He hesitated before offering his hand. Arya slid into his steady grasp, feeling the strength that belied every rumor of frailty. His fingers lingered upon hers with a reverence that made her heart stir. Inside, the chapel smelled faintly of moss and forgotten prayers. Edmund paused before the altar, then admitted he had once intended to remarry here, years before the accident, before the whispers of blindness became a shield. The admission startled Arya, not for the revelation itself but for the sorrow he did not hide. He spoke of an engagement broken by ambition rather than affection. Arya listened, the ache in his voice threading through her own hidden wounds. She confessed she had spent years believing she was too insignificant for devotion, too overshadowed by wealthier daughters and louder beauties. She had prepared for a life of quiet compromise, never imagining rejection would lead her into a marriage meant to rescue her reputation but capable of rescuing her heart. Edmund stepped closer, his eyes steady upon her with a tenderness both unguarded and astonishing. He told her that from the moment she arrived, he had seen more than obligation in her. He had seen strength where others saw fragility. His hand rose to brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek, and she felt the touch like a vow whispered against her skin. Before she could answer, a distant shout pierced the air. Edmund stiffened, moving toward the entrance. Arya followed, her breath catching as a rider emerged from the path below, waving a herald's banner. The messenger dismounted, delivering news from London. The king's advisors had taken renewed interest in Edmund's supposed infirmity, and whispers claimed the crown might soon summon him to appear publicly to prove his incapacity, or expose deception. The words struck Edmund with the force of a blow. Arya watched the quiet shift in his expression, the return of an old fear. She stepped toward him, steadying herself before speaking with a calm she did not entirely feel. Isolation had once protected him, she said, but now he was not alone. His burdens were no longer singular. He looked at her with astonished gratitude, unaccustomed to anyone standing beside him against danger. His hand found hers, trembling faintly, and he admitted he feared not the king's command but the possibility of endangering her by association. Arya answered that she had survived abandonment and gossip. She would not be undone by politics. Yet the messenger had not finished. He drew a sealed letter, addressed to Edmund, bearing the royal crest. With one look, Arya understood it was no mere inquiry. Edmund broke the seal with calm, but his eyes sharpened as he read. The crown suspected misrepresentation, and the duke was ordered to present himself within a fortnight at court, accompanied by his new duchess, whose testimony could determine his fate. Arya felt her breath falter. She had expected scandal, perhaps confrontation, but not the command that threatened to entangle her so directly. Still, she lifted her chin, refusing to let fear speak louder than affection. Edmund folded the letter slowly, shoulders drawn tight with the weight of what he had tried to avoid. For several moments neither spoke. Then Edmund turned to her, voice low but resolute, saying he would face the king if she wished it, or refuse the summons if she feared the repercussions. He gave her a choice where many men of his rank would have offered none. Arya stepped close, placing her hand over his heart. She told him that truth, his and hers, deserved daylight, and she would walk beside him, not because duty demanded it but because she believed in the man behind the tales. His breath caught in quiet awe. Yet as their resolve formed, the messenger revealed one final detail. The court already suspected that Arya, abandoned once and hastily married again, might be complicit in Edmund's deception. The blow landed with chilling precision. Arya felt the ground shift, the magnitude of the threat settling like a shadow across her newfound hope. Edmund's hand tightened around hers, anchoring her even as uncertainty rose around them. And in that suspended moment, as silence thickened between thunder and wind, Arya understood their journey toward truth was no longer a choice. It had become an unavoidable reckoning waiting on the horizon. But even as dread coiled at the edges of her thoughts, another truth pressed through the fear. She no longer felt like a woman discarded by fate. Standing beside Edmund, she sensed a partnership forming with unexpected strength, a bond forged not by convenience but by shared defiance. The chapel's broken walls seemed to echo their resolve, reminding her that every life altered by scandal could also be remade by courage. And courage, she realized, was taking root in her at last. Together forward. A boom of carriage wheels striking uneven cobblestone echoed through the quiet London courtyard as Edmund and Arya arrived before the royal palace, the sound shattering the fragile calm that had held them steady during their long journey south. The jolt sent Arya's pulse racing, not from the movement but from the knowledge that everything they had built, every confession, every fragile step toward trust, would be tested within those walls. The king had summoned them not as honored guests but as subjects under suspicion, and the weight of that truth clung to the air like a tightening cord. Edmund stepped down first, offering his hand to Arya with a steadiness she clung to. His eyes, once hollowed by years of seclusion, now burned with a quiet resolve that wrapped itself around her own courage. She accepted his hand, drawing strength from the warmth of his touch. Together they crossed the threshold, their footsteps echoing through the long marble corridor where portraits of monarchs seemed to watch their progress with cold, painted scrutiny. Every whisper of silk from Arya's gown carried the memory of her past humiliation, the wedding she never had, the reputation she barely salvaged. Yet she walked upright, refusing to shrink beneath the eyes that followed her. Edmund matched her stride, the elegant precision of his movements revealing to any observer the truth he had hidden. No blind man carried himself with such restrained power. Aware of the danger, he neither masked nor flaunted the truth. He merely allowed himself to move naturally beside his wife. The chamberlain met them at the entrance to the council chamber, his expression unreadable as he announced their arrival. The heavy doors opened. Inside, members of the Privy Council stood in a semicircle, their faces sharp with curiosity and concealed judgment. At the center, beneath banners bearing the royal crest, sat the king, older than Edmund remembered, but with eyes still capable of cutting through defenses. Arya inhaled slowly as they stepped forward, feeling the vast room close around her. Edmund bowed deeply. She curtsied, her movements graceful despite the storm churning beneath her calm exterior. The king regarded Edmund with a mixture of disappointment and intrigue before shifting his gaze to Arya, who felt the weight of his scrutiny like a draft through an open doorway. The summons began not with anger but with cold, measured questions. Why had Edmund secluded himself for so long? Why had he permitted his household to spread the tale of blindness? Why had he appeared before the crown only now, and accompanied by a new bride whose own past was tangled in scandal? The inquiries grew sharper, circling the truth like foxes closing upon prey. Edmund answered with honesty. He admitted to retreating after the hunting accident left him not blind but shaken, unwilling to become a pawn in political struggles he had no desire to join. He confessed he had allowed the misconception to persist because it granted him the solitude he believed he needed. But he did not apologize for choosing quiet over the relentless pressures of court life. The council murmured, some unsatisfied, others silently impressed by his candor. The king, however, shifted his attention to Arya, whose heartbeat thundered at the sudden scrutiny. He asked whether she knew of Edmund's deception when she wed him. She did not flinch. She told the truth. She discovered it on their wedding night, yet found no treachery in his revelation, only trust. The king observed her carefully, his expression inscrutable. He asked whether she, abandoned once before, had entered this marriage for protection or advantage. The bluntness of the question stabbed at the old wound she carried, yet she answered without trembling. She said she entered the union with humility, expecting nothing but respect from a man rumored to be distant. Instead, she found kindness where she least expected it, kindness that had given her courage she once believed she lacked. Her words softened something in the air. Even the counselors, accustomed to the brittle posturing of nobles, seemed struck by the simplicity of her sincerity. Aping their path, but the king was not finished. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, and asked Edmund one final question. If summoned to serve the crown again, would he accept his responsibilities without concealment? The inquiry sliced through the chamber, carrying the weight of a demand masked as diplomacy. Edmund's breath tightened. He turned his head just slightly toward Arya, not for permission but for strength. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with unwavering support. Whatever choice he made, she would endure it beside him. Edmund faced the king again, his voice steady as he declared he would serve only if he could do so without compromising his principles, or endangering those he held dear. He would not allow the crown to turn his private life into a spectacle, nor force his wife into the mire of political rivalry. If called, he would meet the duty, but not at the cost of becoming a man he no longer recognized. The chamber fell silent at the boldness of his answer. The king, after a long pause, released a breath that seemed half irritation and half admiration. He pronounced the council satisfied. Edmund had not deceived the crown for personal gain, and Arya was no conspirator in whatever isolation he had chosen. The matter, he declared, was closed. A tremor of relief passed through Arya, though she fought to keep it from her posture. Edmund's shoulders loosened imperceptibly. Yet before they could retreat, the king added a final decree. Hawthorne Hall, once forgotten by the crown, would be expected to host a midsummer gathering to mark the Duke's re-entry into society. It was not a punishment but a test of openness, of unity, of the marriage that had become the subject of gossip in every drawing room. Arya felt the words settle over her with unexpected weight. A royal gathering at their home meant hundreds of eyes, dozens of whispers, scrutiny sharper than any she had faced. Edmund's jaw tightened, though he bowed in acceptance. As they stepped out of the chamber, the doors closing behind them with a hollow thud, Arya felt Edmund's hand slip into hers. His grip was warm, steady, grateful. They had survived the king's judgment, but the greater trial, the one that would test their bond before the entire watchful world, still lay ahead. And as they paused at the top of the palace steps, the distant boom of a carriage door slamming below echoed upward, a reminder that fate had not finished reshaping their path.